This video was sponsored by Ipsos I say. It's been a long time since our last meta update for Earth, so we are going to be covering the strongest and weakest classes that are currently in the game. First up we have the business class, which has been absolutely dominating since the devs reworked it from the merchant class a few patches back. A very popular class for players trying to maximize their money farmed per hour. A lot of people love going business because of its lower requirements to other comparable classes. You only need moderate stats and intelligence and fortitude to spec into the business class, and at higher levels, the money generation usually greatly outpaces other highly skilled jobs for much less investment. Players can also spec into some really powerful late game perks such as lobbying, which allows you to change laws you don't like, and lawyer up, which greatly reduces a penalty for committing a crime. The business class remains in high S tier, and players shouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. We now come to entertainment, which has received a huge rework in recent years. Staple entertainment subclasses such as artists and musicians are still extremely popular, but they are also joined with newer film and digital media builds as well. Quite interestingly, a recent patch actually moved the journalist subclass into the entertainment category after greatly lowering its stat requirements across the board. The entertainment class usually requires a fair amount of charisma and creativity to be successful. However, this can be offset by the nepotism perk, which is a buff applied by another high-level player. A significant downside to the entertainment tree is that there are actually limited spaces for the higher tier subclasses, such as film actor and stage musician, which unfortunately leads to most entertainment builds having a lower than average income stat. With this in mind, the devs have heard these concerns by the player base, which is why the new influencer class has removed almost all charisma and creativity requirements to reach higher levels. We now come to the tech class, another fairly new category which has shot up in popularity after having some of the most powerful builds in the game. As we know, high intelligence builds have been meta for the last few patches, and all tech subclasses require a pretty heavy investment of this stat. The devs say that these new builds like programmers, data analysts, and cybersecurity specialists were all designed to capture the same spirit as old wizard builds, as nobody knows what they do, and nobody cares to ask. This makes them pair exceptionally well with players from the business class, as usually both players have convinced themselves that they are ripping the other one off. Throwing some extra points in creativity can never hurt for the tech class, because solving problems players made for themselves will be around 80% of the gameplay loop for a tech main. Retail and hospitality, as we know, is a starter class, meaning most players will usually move into something else once the initial requirements have been met. It's no secret that this is generally considered a low tier class to main into late game, excepting a few builds, which is usually why most players will flex into something else as soon as they are able. One of the reasons why this class is ranked so low is because players need to commit to a high fortitude stat early to avoid the customer bullshit debuff, which unfortunately stacks. Chef mains in particular are nerfed the hardest by this mechanic, which is why, when you see an average chef in the wild, it's not uncommon to see them hit with 600 stacks, which still haven't expired after 8 years on the job. This class isn't easy, the money generation is low, and the higher levels are underwhelming compared to other categories, but it certainly allows newer players to experience the harder game mechanics early into their playthrough. As we've previously covered, tech and business are currently dominating the meta, meaning tech companies are making absolute bank by selling your data to anyone with a thick enough wallet. In an ideal situation, you'd be able to cut out the middleman and get paid directly for this privilege, which is exactly what today's sponsor, Ipsos I say, is aiming to do. Ipsos is a nearly 50-year-old market research company who want to pay you for your opinion, and judging by the comment section of my last Overwatch video, you collectively have enough of those to comfortably bankrupt the company. The basic premise is simple. Ipsos will offer you to answer a few surveys about topics that interest you, and you'll be able to redeem credit for things like PayPal, DoorDash, or Amazon. I expect many of you have probably signed up to these types of survey apps before and never seen a cent for your time, but Ipsos is literally the third largest research agency in the world, so they need the opinions of as many people as they can. This money farming method isn't about to get a person rich for completing a few surveys while they're watching Netflix, but you might be able to pay for your favorite battle pass every few months, which isn't exactly a bad deal if you could stand to earn a few easy dollars. Then a link to sign up to I say will be down below, because if your data is being sold anyway, the money is going to feel much better in your pocket. Next up we have trades, which come with many exciting subclasses such as carpenter, electrician, and plumber. Players looking for well-rounded builds absolutely love the trades class, because after all, they don't call it the jack of all trades for nothing. Players will get to dip a little bit into intelligence, charisma, athletics, creativity, and fortitude when playing a trades build, but at the same time, none of these skills need any heavy investment, unlike other min-maxed classes. A huge benefit of the trades subclasses is although the work itself isn't usually that hard, other players have no idea how the fuck your skills are supposed to work. This means that by simply having proficiency with a wrench and hammer, you're able to charge other players more than they'd like, but less than it would take to ruin their day. The mechanic subclass in particular has a whole skill tree for this strategy, and high charisma builds are able to double their money generation if they pick their targets wisely. One of the most unique playstyles comes from the military class, which unlocks abilities and items unavailable to other players, but also restricts the player from many other activities. In previous patches, players would usually be assigned to the military class with RNG, but this is a feature which has since been turned off in most servers. Following the modern combat update, players will want to invest hard in both athletics and fortitude to become successful in this class, and it should be noted that high creativity builds will face small debuffs early into their class progression. Not only is the military class one of the few in the game currently focused on combat, but it also comes with its very own progression system, which eventually unlocks some seriously powerful abilities. This includes calling in airstrikes and forcing other military players to emote. What makes the military class so unique is although you lose many quality of life features, players gain exclusive perks such as access to a mess hall, which serves free food. They also get the ability to mitigate paying taxes altogether, a feature usually only reserved for high-level business mains. This class seems to receive constant reworks and most of the attention from the developers, so players who want the most updated content in the game might be interested in a military build. Education is another unique category, as it's usually viewed as a tutorial for all the other classes. Education is an almost pure intelligence class, meaning people who spread their stat points out tend to move on to other builds, while those only maxing intelligence will tend to remain long after the tutorial phase. In recent patches, players have been complaining that the devs have made the cost of this class too high, which has generally led to players achieving their mid to late game milestones later into their playthrough. Others believe that business mains currently have too many meta-shaping perks that influence other classes. In any case, as the education tree is a requirement for most other classes, it will likely always remain meta-relevant going into the future. If there's one class that could have any hope in dethroning business for the best class in the game, it's politics. Although the most powerful subclasses such as kings or emperors have been heavily nerfed or removed entirely, politics is still dominant at higher levels and has been the single most meta-defining class of all time. Unlike most other classes, which can be spec'd into after meeting the skill requirements, the politics class has limited player slots and requires players to compete against each other. For even the lower to mid-tier subclasses, such as local council members or small town mayors, intelligence is a welcome stat to have for players in the politics class, but it's certainly not a requirement. The current meta actually sees charisma-based builds win against intelligence builds most of the time, and intelligence builds will actually be debuffed when campaigning in low intelligence areas. This is why it's recommended to focus on charisma and only start building on other stats late game if it's really necessary. The revenue generation for this class tends to rely a lot less on the subclass itself and much more on how much a player flexes into the corruption skill tree. Quite thankfully, the devs have added a lobbying mechanic for this class, which allows political mains to trade favors for cash without the risk of having to play through the incarceration questline. It's not exactly the most intuitive class to play, but players who want to shape the meta will feel right at home with a political build. We now come to medicine, which is another very popular class with a high intelligence requirement. To even reach the requirement for the doctor subclass, for example, players need to grind most of their way through the education class, which means the subclass doesn't even come online until the early mid-game. Another sizable hurdle for the medicine class is its fairly high fortitude requirement. This stat is controversially a hidden requirement for this class, which is why the attrition rate for the nurse subclass tends to be one of the highest in the game. Nurse mains were particularly impacted by the COVID-19 world event several patches back, leading many to respec into classes with better quality of life features. Although lacking the power of the politics class and the sheer money generation from pure business builds, medicine mains earn infinitely more prestige, which opens up other unique mechanics. Military mains will often dip into the medicine skill tree to play the combat medic subclass, which has powerful AoE buffs, which make allied soldiers 400% more bloodthirsty if an enemy shoots within 30 meters of their position. Most players who choose medicine, however, do so to score the Proud Parents achievement, the difficulty of which varies depending on a player's starting server. Players who aren't looking for prestige generation may alternatively be interested in the crime class. The developers have obviously reworked crime a lot over the years, as it used to be that as long as a player wasn't present when law enforcement arrived, they were almost certainly going to get away with their misdeeds. Today, however, although crime is much harder from a viability standpoint, punishments for getting caught are generally much lower, meaning players aren't likely to serve prison time for stealing basic necessities. Unlike other classes, who don't gain any benefit from the incarceration quest line, crime mains will actually receive a sizable experience boost from their time on the inside. Although some rehabilitation style institutions will grant incentives for players to change classes altogether. We also see a number of crime related jobs such as pirate become entirely unviable, while players who flex into the tech class will gain access to newer builds such as hacker or scammer. Crime mains can usually expect slightly higher than average money generation in the early game, but at the higher end, only players who have a serious investment in all other stats will be able to compete with other meta classes. This is why crime is generally seen as an unviable class in the end game, as it has too many downsides to be considered worth the investment. This next class is controversial, as many players argue whether it should even be in the game at all. We are of course talking about the emergency class. The reason this class is so divisive is because although unique, most subclasses within emergency could quite easily fit within other classes already. The police subclass could vaguely be associated with the military, but its perks are very much focused on influencing civilian players. Likewise, paramedics are more of a flex class with medicine, but their skills are considered specialized enough to justify their own subclass. It's the very same thing when we talk about firefighters, as many would consider them part of the nature class, but wouldn't feel comfortable comparing them to a farmer or geologist. Part of what makes the emergency class so unique is that although the subclasses work together very frequently, their stat requirements are entirely different across the board. Money generation for all subclasses is quite similar, especially at higher levels. However, police typically don't receive quite as much prestige as the other choices, owing to the controversial tickets and fines mechanic. Overall, the emergency class is perfect for pretty much any playstyle. One of the most overlooked classes is logistics, which is insane for just how diverse it's become. If any player has ever wanted to get something from one place to another, a logistics player has been there to make it happen. Long past the days of horses and messengers, logistics players make up anything from taxi drivers, truckers, ship captains, or pilots. In fact, the logistics class might be one of the most iterated by the devs over the game's lifespan, and new changes are still being made at a blistering pace. Logistics mains themselves haven't always been happy with recent changes, however, as with the controversial Union nerf a few patches back, many logistics players have seen several quality of life features removed, and have seen their money generation toned down. Due to its broad scale, the stat requirements within logistics can vary wildly, with some subclasses requiring years of specialized training, while others can be done with nothing but a standard driver's license, which can usually be earned pretty easily in the early game. Data miners have already speculated that a space-based update might be heading into the game at some point during the future, but the space region will likely be restricted to all but specialized astronaut players until tech mains can figure out how to make the process a little easier. Last, but certainly not least, we have the nature class, one of the oldest but most reworked in the game. Before the infamous Industrial Revolution update, farmer mains made up around 90% of the entire player base, and those lucky enough to get any revenue generation usually did so in very low quantities. After the player base discovered a whole hidden agricultural skill tree, farming has become much more efficient for a much smaller portion of the player base, although its revenue generation still very much relies on RNG, much to the dismay of dedicated farmer mains. The nature class was once the home to many specialist playstyles such as shamans and soothsayers, players who were able to predict the future and warn against catastrophic events. Today, however, these abilities are largely the domain of climatologist mains, who warn of a world event that will change the fabric of society and disable quality of life features for generations to come. Although 99.9% of data miners have been able to verify that such an event exists in the game files, the player base has remained uninterested in preventing such an event from happening. This concludes all the main classes within the game right now. If viewers have any special tips for their own subclass, or if you want us to make specific guides on any of the classes you've seen today, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Until next time, have fun and embrace the bullshit.